When police entered a modest home in Indianapolis in 1965, they found something so disturbing. One officer said it was worse than anything he saw in the war. A teenage girl lay lifeless, emaciated, beaten, burned. Her name was Sylvia Likens. She was just 16. What happened to her, and how so many people stood by and said nothing, would haunt the nation for decades. This isn't a story about a stranger in the dark. It's about the people you know, the ones who smile in public and shut the door behind you. The Silence on East New York Street starts now. Welcome to the Crime Catalogue, where we explore the truths behind the headlines. Stay tuned, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping crime stories. Sylvia Marie Likens was born on January 3, 1949. The third of 5 children in a family that never stayed in one place too long. Her parents, Lester and Betty Likens, worked the traveling carnival circuit, selling soda, candy, and snacks across the Midwest. Summers were for booths and rides. Winters were for packing up and moving again. Sylvia lived in the middle of 2 sets of twins. Her older siblings, Daniel and Diana, and her younger brother and sister, Benny and Jenny. Jenny had polio. It left one of her legs weaker than the other, and she wore a steel brace to walk. Sylvia never made her feel less than. In fact, she always made sure Jenny felt safe. They weren't rich. They didn't have a permanent home. But Sylvia didn't let that weigh her down. She found joy in the small things: roller skating with her sister, ironing clothes for neighbors to earn spare change, singing along to Beatles records, scribbling notes in a journal. She had long, wavy brown hair and a tooth missing from a childhood accident, but she never let it dim her smile. Her friends called her Cookie. Sometimes, her parents would leave her and Jenny with relatives while they hit the road with the boys. It was safer that way, they believed. Sylvia didn't complain. She understood. She was the kind of girl who offered her own money to help her mother, who helped Jenny skate by holding her hand, who stayed behind so her brothers could earn. She was protective, soft-spoken in public, lively at home. She didn't stand out much, but she was always there when someone needed her. The kind of presence that's easy to take for granted until it's gone. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia was 16. She had dreams like most girls her age. Nothing big, just stability. Maybe a real school to attend full-time. Maybe a quiet life one day, away from the constant motion. She didn't know that by fall, her name would be remembered not for who she was, but for what was done to her. Sylvia wasn't perfect, but she was kind, protective, and completely unaware that her life would soon take a turn into a nightmare. In the summer of 1965, Sylvia and Jenny Likens were placed in the care of a woman named Gertrude Baniszewski. To most people in the neighborhood, Gertrude appeared to be just another worn-out mother doing her best with what little she had. She lived in a rented house on East New York Street in Indianapolis. The place was small, run-down, and crowded. Inside lived Gertrude and her 7 children: Paula, Stephanie, John, Marie, Shirley, James, and baby Dennis. The oldest was 17. The youngest was barely out of diapers. Gertrude was 36, but life had aged her well beyond her years. Thin, frail, with hollow cheeks and tired eyes. She smoked constantly, coughed often, and carried the weight of several failed marriages and a string of disappointments. The house survived on child support checks, odd sewing jobs, and borrowed help from neighbors. Some said she was just trying to hold her family together. Others kept their distance. When Lester Likens, Sylvia's father, needed a place for his daughters to stay while he and his wife traveled with the carnival, Gertrude offered a solution: $20 a week. A promise to care for Sylvia and Jenny as if they were her own. She seemed agreeable, religious, even. She had daughters the same age. They all attended the same high school. It felt like the right fit. So Lester said yes. He dropped the girls off with their suitcases, gave Gertrude the first week's payment, and drove off. He never looked back. And Sylvia, smiling politely as she stood in a stranger's home, had no idea her life had just been handed over. At first, things seemed normal. Church on Sundays, house chores, meals around the table. Sylvia sang songs with Stephanie, helped around the house, attended school. The girls blended into the family. They even impressed the pastor during Sunday school. But normal didn't last. Gertrude, behind closed doors, was not the calm caretaker she appeared to be. She was brittle, quick to anger, worn down by stress, illness, and deep resentment. The money Lester promised arrived late some weeks. Not by much, a day or two, but that was enough. Gertrude began to show her cracks. She would complain about being taken advantage of, about feeding mouths that weren't hers to feed. She claimed the girls were ungrateful. She lectured them. Then she began to punish them. Small things at first: chores redone, raised voices, missed meals. Sylvia, polite and eager to please, tried harder. But it didn't matter. Gertrude saw something in Sylvia that set her off. Maybe it was her youth. Her smile. The fact that Sylvia had dreams, or that she was gentle and well-liked. Maybe it was because Sylvia reminded Gertrude of everything she had lost, or never had. Paula, Gertrude's oldest daughter, joined in. Sylvia was accused of eating too much, of lying, of being spoiled. None of it was true. But in that house, truth no longer mattered. There was only Gertrude's version of it. Still, to the outside world, everything looked fine. The family kept up appearances. Sylvia still went to school, still wore a smile, still held Jenny's hand at the skating rink. Neighbors waved. Kids laughed out front. Parents walked by. No one noticed. Or maybe no one wanted to. The house on East New York Street looked like any other. But for Sylvia Likens, it was becoming something else entirely. And the door that had been opened to welcome her in was slowly closing behind her. The payments didn't always arrive on time. Some weeks, Sylvia and Jenny's boarding fee came a day late. Sometimes two. Gertrude didn't ask why. She didn't write letters or call. Instead, she stewed. She claimed she had mouths to feed and no money to do it. And then she turned to the two girls who weren't hers. The shift was sudden, quiet at first. Gertrude's voice got sharper. Her eyes lingered longer. Then came the punishments. She started with words, calling Sylvia lazy, ungrateful. She accused her of eating too much, of stealing food that wasn't hers, of lying about boys. Then came the paddle. Sylvia and Jenny were hit for things no one could prove. Being too loud, too quiet, not cleaning fast enough, eating too much at a church dinner. One night, Paula claimed Sylvia had eaten more than her share. Gertrude didn't ask questions. She lined the girls up and hit them both, 15 times across the back with a thick wooden paddle. Sylvia tried to hold in her tears. Jenny just looked down. From there, it grew. Sylvia was singled out. The punishments were harsher. The accusations became more personal. Gertrude told the others in the house that Sylvia was spreading rumors, that she was sleeping around, that she was dirty. She asked questions Sylvia didn't understand. About boys, about sex. When Sylvia shrugged, unsure how to answer, Gertrude said she was pregnant. Said she could see it in her stomach. Sylvia laughed. Nervous. Said maybe she needed to go on a diet. Gertrude didn't laugh back. The next time, Gertrude kicked Sylvia hard, right between the legs. Paula joined in, screaming that Sylvia wasn't fit to sit at the table. She knocked her from her chair. Sylvia hit the floor. The others watched. No one stopped it. The beatings became daily, then multiple times a day. Sylvia was slapped, shoved, punched, kicked, burned with cigarettes. At dinner, she was force-fed food covered in mustard and spices until she vomited. Then she was made to eat what she threw up. She was denied food, made to scavenge leftovers from the trash, laughed at when she gagged, slapped when she asked for water. Bruises formed under her sleeves. Cuts and burns covered her legs. Her lips swelled. Her eyes dimmed. But still, she tried to protect Jenny. Still, she tried to survive. This wasn't punishment. It was control. Gertrude told the children Sylvia was filthy, a liar, a bad influence. She told them to hit her, and they did, again and again. Neighbors, friends, kids from down the street. They stopped by like it was a game. They used her like a training dummy, practiced judo moves on her, held her down, took turns. Gertrude watched. Sometimes she gave instructions. Sylvia was burned with matches, cigarettes, belt buckles. She was whipped, starved, forbidden from bathing, mocked in front of others. Her genitals were injured. She was accused of things she never did, punished for lies someone else made up. Once, they made her strip in the living room. Surrounded by Gertrude's children and a group of neighborhood boys, Sylvia was forced to do things no child should even be asked. Gertrude said it was to teach Jenny what kind of girl her sister really was. This was no longer a secret. It wasn't hidden. The door to the house stayed open. Visitors came and went. They saw her. They heard her. Some joined in. And Sylvia, this quiet, kind, 16-year-old girl, was breaking. Not all at once, but piece by piece. This is a child abuse case that shocked the country. A crime so severe, so deliberate, that it still echoes today. The torture of Sylvia Likens wasn't an isolated act. It happened day after day, right in a house that looked like every other. No police were called. No adults stepped in. The signs were clear, but no one acted. And as the days went on, the girl who used to hold her sister's hand and skate through the neighborhood was now fighting to stay conscious, fighting to stay alive. This is the unbelievable true story of Sylvia Likens. And it was only getting worse. The house on East New York Street sat in plain view. It didn't stand out, peeling paint, a small porch, worn curtains in the windows. A place people passed by every day. A place they thought they understood. Inside that house, Sylvia Likens was slipping away. Day by day, hour by hour. The bruises on her face were no longer hidden. Her eyes, once bright, were swollen. Her walk was slower. Her head hung lower. And still, she went outside. Still, she was seen. Neighbors visited the house. They came inside. They talked with Gertrude. They watched her children joke and tease. They sat in the same room where Sylvia sat quietly, trying not to cry. Some saw the bruises. Some saw her flinch when someone moved too quickly. Some heard Gertrude call her names, accuse her of things that didn't make sense. They left, said nothing, and returned days later. One couple, the Vermillions, came by more than once. On both visits, they saw Sylvia with a black eye. They watched Paula openly brag about hitting her. One time, Paula said, "I tried to kill her." And then she laughed. The Vermillions said nothing. They didn't call the police. They never knocked on another door. Across the street, a neighbor heard something else, screaming. Not once, but repeatedly. The voice was faint, but clear enough to raise concern. It came from the basement. A girl crying, calling out. At 3 in the morning. It stopped suddenly. And instead of picking up the phone, the neighbor went back to bed. In the school Sylvia once attended, a nurse was alerted by a phone call. The report was anonymous. A girl with open sores all over her body, living at the Baniszewski home. The nurse visited. Gertrude met her at the door and said Sylvia had run away. Said she was a bad influence. Said she refused to bathe. The nurse took the explanation, turned around, and left. No further action was taken. One day, Sylvia and Jenny saw their older sister Diana at the park. They told her about the beatings, about the hunger, about how Sylvia was being targeted. But they never gave her the address. They weren't sure what would happen if they did. Diana thought maybe they were exaggerating. She walked away. Another time, Sylvia told the truth to a neighborhood child. She said she was starving. The child's father called the school, hoping they would step in. They didn't. People knew. People saw. But no one acted. There were chances. There were windows. Moments when someone could have stepped forward. Could have picked up the phone. Knocked on the door. Said something. Done anything. But no one did. Sylvia was being tortured in a house full of people, in a neighborhood full of adults, in a city full of systems designed to protect children. And somehow, none of it reached her. There were those who joined in. Children who mocked her. Laughed while she was burned, pushed, beaten. Some were as young as 10. Some brought friends to watch. It was a spectacle. A house of games. At the center of it, a girl who had once spent her weekends skating with her sister, now trapped, starving, injured, and ignored. Let that sink in. A 16-year-old girl, bruised and broken, screamed for help in the middle of the night. And no one came. What would you have done? If you heard cries coming through the wall? If you saw a child with bruises that didn't fade? Would you knock? Call someone? Say something? Or would you do what so many others did? Look away. Let us know in the comments. Because Sylvia was there. And so were they. By October, the house was no longer a home. It was something else entirely. And Sylvia, once allowed to move freely from room to room, was now confined to the basement. It wasn't a punishment. It was a sentence. The room was cold, damp, and dark. There was no bed, no blanket, not even a place to sit comfortably. Sylvia was stripped of everything, her voice, her rights, her dignity. She was locked away like a secret no one wanted to see. Food became rare. Water was a privilege. When she cried out, she was ignored. When she pleaded, she was mocked. And when she collapsed from exhaustion, she was kicked until she moved again. They called it discipline. It was far from that. Cigarette burns lined her skin. Not one or two, but dozens. Her body bore the marks of matches, belts, fists, and shoes. Her fingertips were scorched. Her lips cracked. Her face was swollen. The smell of sweat, blood, and filth filled the air. She was forced to soil herself. Not allowed to use the bathroom. No one cleaned her. No one offered her fresh clothes. And when she cried out in pain or shame, she was told she deserved it. But it wasn't just the beatings or the starvation. It was the public humiliation. The way she was paraded in front of others. The way Gertrude invited neighborhood children to come down and see her. Some paid a nickel. Some came just to watch. Sylvia was mocked, ridiculed, used for entertainment. One day, Gertrude brought her up from the basement and into the kitchen. She told Sylvia to strip. Told her she needed to learn a lesson. In front of several people, children, teenagers, Gertrude pressed a heated needle against Sylvia's stomach. The metal sizzled against her skin. She etched the words slowly, one letter at a time. I'm a prostitute and proud of it. Sylvia didn't scream. She bit down, held back the pain. But the burns blistered instantly. The skin around the letters began to swell. When Gertrude grew tired, she handed the needle to one of the boys. 14 years old. He finished the job while Sylvia lay still, her body trembling. As if that wasn't enough, they tried to carve an S beneath her left breast. It came out backwards, like a number 3. A permanent mark. Another message. Another scar. Later that night, Sylvia whispered to Jenny through the basement door. Her voice was weak, just loud enough to carry through the cracks. She whispered to me, "Jenny, I know I'm going to die." And she was right. Sylvia knew. And so did Jenny. But there was no escape. No rescue. No one coming. She was now a ghost inside a body that hadn't stopped breathing. Her hands were tied. Her legs too weak to stand. Her body broken. Her spirit fading. And still, Gertrude would return. Still, the children would gather. Still, the beatings continued. This is where the story should have stopped. But it didn't. What happened next would shock even hardened police officers. And it only gets worse. Sylvia tried to run. Somewhere in the fading corners of her mind, a piece of her still believed in rescue, still believed in escape. It was October 25th when she made her move. Her body was weak. She hadn't had a real meal in days. Her legs shook. Her arms dragged behind her. But she found a moment, brief, desperate, and forced herself toward the stairs. She reached the door. She grabbed the handle. She made it to the front room. But she didn't get far. Gertrude caught her. Sylvia collapsed before she could reach the outside. Her strength gave out before the lock could turn. Her voice didn't carry past the walls. They dragged her back. That night, she was beaten again. This time with a curtain rod, thin enough to whip through the air, strong enough to bend from the force. Gertrude hit her first, then handed the rod to Coy Hubbard. He struck her once, hard, until it bent in half. Sylvia fell limp. They carried her to the basement and left her there. Later that night, long past midnight, the screams returned. Sylvia was pounding the walls with a spade, crying, begging, her voice rising through the floorboards. A neighbor heard everything, heard the banging, heard the voice of a girl calling for help. It was 3 a.m. The noise stopped. No call was made. The next morning, Sylvia couldn't speak. She was awake, but barely. Her mouth trembled. Her words slurred. She couldn't hold a glass of water. Gertrude grew frustrated and threw her to the floor. Later, she tried feeding her a donut. Sylvia couldn't lift it to her mouth. Her hands wouldn't work. Her head tilted to one side. Gertrude stormed out and sent her back to the basement. Sylvia's final hours were slow. Her eyes wandered. She mumbled nonsense. Her body had shut down. Her skin was cold. Her mind slipping. She couldn't remember names. Couldn't tell the difference between faces anymore. She was hallucinating. Paula asked her to say the alphabet. Sylvia could only get to the letter D. She had defecated on herself. Gertrude shouted at her to clean it. She couldn't move. Later, as more children filed into the basement, Sylvia raised her hand weakly, tried to point at the people around her. Her voice came in fragments. "You're Ricky. You're Gertie." She tried to bite into a pear someone had tossed at her. Her teeth were too loose. It fell from her hands. Jenny told her the truth. "Don't you remember, Sylvia? Your front tooth got knocked out when you were 7. Sylvia didn't respond. At some point, they brought in a hose. They sprayed her with freezing water. John Baniszewski laughed as he turned the handle. Sylvia crawled toward the stairs. She fell. Gertrude stepped over her, stamped on her head. By late afternoon, Stephanie found her body and tried to wash her. She dressed her in clean clothes, laid her on a mattress. Sylvia murmured her final wish. "I wish Daddy was here. Take me home." And then she was still. When the police finally arrived, the house was quiet. Sylvia lay on the mattress, her skin bruised, her face cut, her body starved. There was no need to ask what happened. The truth was written across every inch of her. As officers began questioning those inside the house, Jenny was quiet. She had practiced what to say. She knew what Gertrude told her to repeat. But then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she leaned toward one of the officers and said, "Get me out of here. I'll tell you everything." And she did. The front door opened at 3850 East New York Street just after 6:30 in the evening. Inside, the officers were met with calm faces and still bodies. Gertrude Baniszewski led them through the hallway, holding a Bible in one hand, a letter in the other. She spoke softly, said Sylvia had run away days ago, then returned that afternoon, half-dressed, bruised, holding the note. She said the girl had been attacked by a gang of boys. Said she tried to help her. Rubbed alcohol on her wounds. Sat by her side. The officers followed her into a bedroom. On the floor lay Sylvia Likens. Her body was cold, thin, battered. The mattress beneath her was stained. Her lips had been chewed through. Her face was swollen. Her arms bruised. Her stomach bore letters burned into her skin. No one in the room cried. Paula looked on without expression. Stephanie sat nearby. John watched from the hallway. Jenny stood still, eyes fixed on the ground. Gertrude handed over the letter. It was clumsy. A poor attempt to blame people who didn't exist. It claimed Sylvia had agreed to meet some boys for sex. That they turned on her, beat her, branded her, left her on the Baniszewski's doorstep. The officers listened. They took notes. Then one turned to Jenny and gently asked if she had anything she wanted to say. She hesitated, then whispered the words that would change everything. "Get me out of here. I'll tell you everything." By the end of the night, Gertrude Baniszewski, Paula, Stephanie, John Jr., Coy Hubbard, and Richard Hobbs were all in custody. More names would follow. Teenagers, younger children, neighbors. Some had helped. Others had watched. A few had said nothing for weeks. The autopsy was clear. Sylvia had over 150 wounds on her body. Burns, bruises, deep cuts, open sores. Her genitals had been mutilated. Her lips torn. Her fingers broken. Her face almost unrecognizable. The cause of death was a subdural hematoma, blunt force trauma to the head. But that wasn't the whole story. It wasn't one blow. It was everything. Starvation, dehydration, infection, repeated injury. The body had shut down. One investigator called it the most sadistic crime in Indiana's history. The trial began in April 1966. 5 defendants sat in the courtroom together. Gertrude Baniszewski, her daughter Paula, her son John, and 2 boys from the neighborhood, Coy Hubbard and Richard Hobbs. They were charged with the murder of Sylvia Likens. The courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the benches. The public wanted answers. Jenny testified first. She spoke clearly, through tears, explaining what happened to her sister. Explained how Sylvia was accused of things she never did. How she was hit, starved, humiliated, burned. How no one helped. How Jenny herself had been threatened if she spoke out. Others followed. Witness after witness stepped forward, some to admit their guilt, others to describe what they saw. A few even smiled while they testified. One boy admitted to hitting Sylvia as many as 40 times. Another said he watched as matches were held to her skin. One girl described hearing her scream while salt was rubbed into her open wounds. A 13-year-old told the court that Gertrude once sat calmly in a chair, crocheting, while her daughter pulled Sylvia's blouse open in front of a group of boys. A minister admitted he had heard rumors but believed Sylvia was just being punished for misbehaving. The courtroom heard it all. A deputy coroner described Sylvia's body in detail. Lips in shreds, fingernails bent back, layers of skin peeled from her face. He said, "This child endured acts of degradation you wouldn't do to a dog." Gertrude pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. She claimed the house had been chaotic, that she hadn't known what her children were doing, that she hadn't seen it coming. But the branding on Sylvia's stomach, the one Gertrude started with her own hands, told a different story. So did the witnesses. So did Jenny. In May, the jury delivered their verdict. Gertrude Baniszewski was found guilty of first-degree murder. Life in prison. Paula was found guilty of second-degree murder. Coy Hubbard, Richard Hobbs, and John Baniszewski Jr. were convicted of manslaughter. They were teenagers. They would serve only a few years. Gertrude cried as the sentence was read. Paula stared straight ahead. Coy shrugged. Hobbs remained still. John lowered his head. Sylvia was not there to see it. But her voice, through Jenny, through the evidence, through the quiet strength of truth, had finally been heard. Gertrude Baniszewski was sentenced to life in prison. She served 15 years. In 1985, she was granted parole. She walked free from the Indiana Women's Prison and changed her name to Nadine Van Fossen. She told the parole board she was a different person, that she had found God. That she was sorry. She never apologized to Jenny. She never acknowledged what she had done. This wasn't just a crime. It was a failure. A failure of adults. A failure of neighbors. A failure of an entire system that saw the signs and did nothing. So we ask again, why did so many stay silent? What would you have done? Tell us in the comments. This has been the Crime Catalog. Like, comment, and subscribe to hear the stories that must be told. And most importantly, share this story. You never know who might need to hear it.